Okay, well, yeah, the rest of the panel can come up, and I'll introduce Jordash, Kiffiak. First came to Israel in January 2005 at the age of 28 to be near his girlfriend Jo Wu, who was studying at the Hebrew University. She had also convinced him to study at the university as well. So Jordash spent the next few years working toward a PhD in comparative religions, and has recently turned in his dissertation entitled Responses in Miracle Stories in the Gospels. During their 9 and 10 years here, Joe and Jordash were integral members of Narkey Street congregation, teaching in the Shabbat Bible studies, helping lead worship, and working with the sound system. Jordash has a passion for the biblical languages, and over the last 8 years, he has taught them by immersion methods in multiple venues, such as the Biblical Language Center, University of the Holy Land, and through the internet. Joe and Jordash currently live and work in Zurich, Switzerland. Come on, Jordash.
Thanks, Danny. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Something very important gets lost in translation when the phrase b'chol levavcha is rendered in 21st century English as with all your heart. In the worldview expressed through biblical Hebrew, the anatomical organ which pumps blood, the lev, is used symbolically to denote the inner life of a human. The lev is the center of one's being, where one comprehends, remembers, has feelings, forms intentions, and so forth. So when lev is used in the context of cognitive activities in the Hebrew Bible, it is at times translated into English with mind. For example, the Jewish Publication Society translation renders Deuteronomy 29:3 as follows. Yet to this day the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, lev, or eyes to hear or ears to hear, eyes to see or ears to hear. 1 Kings 3:9 reads this way in the JPS. Grant then your servant an understanding mind, lev shomea, to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad, for who can judge this vast people of yours? This is true also when someone speaks to their heart or in their heart. For example, God speaks to himself after the flood, and you get the phrase speaks to himself as opposed to speaks in his heart, to capture that concept in English. That's what the JPS does. Vayomer el libo. Same with Abraham when he laughs and tells himself after hearing God's prediction that Sarah will give birth to a child. Oh, how can this be? Vayomer bel libo. Of course, the lev is also the location of feelings. One example is when the psalmist says, he is at my right hand, I shall never be shaken, so my heart rejoices. Samach libi. My whole being exalts, and my body rests secure. A cursory look at contemporary English-speaking Christian culture, from praise songs to sermons and books, reveals that the heart is commonly understood primarily or exclusively as the part of the self where one experiences feelings, in contrast to one's mind, where one thinks. This is a false dichotomy in terms of biblical perspective. David Hume and other Scottish philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries established this dichotomy, which has since firmly taken hold. The epitome of this understanding is the character Spock. In the original series of Star Trek, he is rigorously rational and at the same time devoid of any feeling. I'll give you briefly, for an example from contemporary Christian culture, the lyrics from a song by Michael W. Smith entitled "Move in Me." In response to the accusation that Michael's faith in God's love is false, he states, "And when those words are said, the questions in me start. And I don't have the answers until I stop thinking with my head and start listening to my heart. And there I find my assurance." The idea of turning one's mind off and listening to one's heart is not derived from an understanding of the Bible in its original languages or cultural contexts. It does not come from the Shema, the portion of Deuteronomy 6 that I began this talk with moments ago, the same text which we, as the Narkey Street congregation, recite collectively every Shabbat. Incidentally, this same dichotomy does not exist in Greek. The ancient Greek word which referred to the anatomical blood-pumping organ, the kardia, we get cardiac arrest from that in other words, other terms, was used, like the Hebrew word lev, metaphorically to refer to the inner life of humans. One reflects, feels, determines, and thinks in one's kardia. Yet unlike Biblical Hebrew, ancient Greek also has more specific terms for the mind. What is shared is that both lev in Hebrew and kardia in Greek refer to much more than feeling, intentions, thinking. Hopefully these introductory remarks have been enough to convince you, if you even needed any convincing, that as followers of Jesus, we are bound to love God through the use of our minds. But just how important is it for us to love God with all of our minds? Some of God's commands are more important than others, aren't they? Jesus, our Rabbi and Lord, thought so. When asked what the most important command was, he replied by citing the opening part of the Shema, especially the command to love God there. Thus, using our mind to worship God is not just a good idea, nor is it optional for the one who wants to please God. Rather, loving God with all one's mind in English, or lev in Hebrew, or kardia in Greek, is an integral aspect of what it means to belong to God and to have accepted the reign of heaven in one's life. Heaven being a euphemism for God. The community of the Narkey Street congregation is an international model and safe haven for those who want to follow Jesus, the Lord and Messiah, by loving God with their minds, in addition to every other aspect of their lives. In what follows, I explore the congregation's DNA in this respect, noting some key characteristics and their historical developments briefly. I'm interested in the legacy of Pastor and Dr. Robert Lindsey, but also those who went before him and his successors. Academic study is an important part, but only one part of what I mean by those in the Narkey Street congregation over the decades who love God with all of their minds. First, however, I will bring in some important autobiographical details. I will read this a little quicker than I did my opening section. I grew up in an evangelical free church and then a Baptist church before, as a teenager in Western Canada, branching out on my own and getting involved in charismatic worship contexts. I had a vibrant and personal commitment as a follower of Jesus. I hosted youth prayer and worship meetings weekly at my parents' place. In different years, I went on outreach to Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. I was active in my local community, both Christian and broader. I loved God. In the third year of my BA, just prior to entering my 20s, I began asking a lot of questions about what I believed to be true about God. I found it troubling, for example, that what God said audibly about Jesus at his transfiguration was recorded differently in each of the Gospels. How could it be that an audible voice of God direct from heaven would not be remembered and preserved accurately by those who experienced the event? But my biggest question was how I knew that Jesus rose from the dead. To Paul's mind, this was a foundational claim, the basis for the good news he proclaimed. Our trust in God is, quote, in vain, and, quote, we are of all people most to be pitied if Jesus did not rise from the dead physically, and correspondingly, we have hope only in this life. At that point, I was a member of a small, independent, charismatic church. No one seemed capable or even interested in helping me answer the types of questions I was asking. I love these people very much. Yet, in fact, some people seemed to take my questions as a threat to their own beliefs. The advice I got from some was that I should stop using my mind and just believe. Others, when they heard about my questions, would tell me with a concerned look on their face and perhaps a patronizing or perhaps a genuinely concerned hand on the shoulder, I'm praying for you, brother. But these came across as spiritualized ways of brushing off my genuine questions. Underlying the responses was a false understanding that the mind is pitted against the heart, or that faith is somehow incompatible with reason. These people were not open to really hearing the questions I had. Such responses by people in my congregation were among the factors that motivated me actually to decide not only to stop participating in the life of a church congregation, but also to stop calling myself a Christian. I would not again claim Jesus as my Lord for another 4 to 5 years. Finding answers to my various questions played, in fact, an important role in my return to faith in Jesus as God's Son and my Lord. Following these troubling years, I did a master's degree in religious studies in Canada before moving to Israel in January 2005, where, following the lead of Jo Wu, then my girlfriend, I should say Dr. Jo Wu, I joined the Northeast Street congregation. In this congregation, more than anywhere else, and I've traveled somewhat extensively, I discovered the joy that there is in loving God with all of my mind. I found that here at my home in Northeast in the Northeast Street congregation. What is the DNA of the Northeast community that makes it such a wonderful place for developing this kind of love for God? And remember, I have never met, like other people from my generation, Gary Alley, Brian Kvasnica, Jo Wu, I have never met Bob Lindsey. One important aspect in my experience of the congregation was participating in the Parashat HaShavua Bible study. Within my first week of being in Israel, I believe, Joe brought me to the study, which met then at Brian and Shoshi Kvasnika's place on Nevi'im Street. There we read through the weekly Torah portion in Hebrew and discussed it in English. Brian's library was full of books about the language, culture, and geography associated with the Hebrew Bible, which would be pulled off of the shelf whenever duty called. Various specialists were present alongside academic novices like myself, and also interested lay people. The atmosphere was collegial and unpretentious. There was vibrant interest in understanding the biblical text, and lively debate was no stranger to the group. There was little fear of asking difficult questions about the Bible, about God. Sometimes people had answers to such questions that made me feel uncomfortable. Nevertheless, there was room enough for all of us to be who we were, where we were on our journeys. There was no one teacher. I learned enormous amounts from such people as Gary and Sharon Alley, Brian and Shoshi Kvasnika, Aaron Horncall, and when present, Randall and Margaret Booth. Also Brian Schultz and others that I can't remember at the moment. After eagerly awaiting my turn to read, there was patience for me as I slowly made my way through a verse of the Hebrew text. Those were difficult days when I was just barely learning to read Hebrew out loud. Of course, the congregational meetings on Shabbat were an important part in helping me to grow in loving God with my mind. Here on a weekly basis, people effortlessly rattled off in Hebrew what Jesus considered to be the 2 greatest commands, while I tried desperately to follow along. I would practice throughout the week to try to be ready for next Shabbat to say the Shema. Someone would speak about the week's Torah reading on the Saturday meeting and offer their insights. Someone else would read a portion from the New Testament and offer comments on it. Often there would be a greeting from a Christian worker visiting from some other part of Israel, elsewhere in the Middle East, or farther away, bringing news of the latest developments there, including what God was doing in the midst of often difficult circumstances. Even the person making the announcements and facilitating the collection of the financial offering would often reflect on a personal experience, encouraging the rest of us. All of this was in addition to the person giving the main message. Even the person preaching rotated weekly. The result for me was that I was continually exposed to different perspectives, often complementary, at times in conflict. There was no effort made to promote a specific party line. As I came to learn, Pastor Chuck Kopp, the main pastor, felt comfortable with the fact that teaching was not his primary gift. Rather than feeling threatened by others in this regard, he sought to encourage them in their gifts. People of vastly differing social and theological backgrounds, from Southern Baptist to Pentecostal and from scholar to social worker, were found on the podium. Owing to this diversity, I came to expect that while no speaker would have a perfect view on a given topic, there would always be something I could learn from them. It was refreshing to go out with others following the service, often with people roughly my own age, and to hear their perspective on the day's message, or messages, expressing freely what they thought without fear of somehow being later chastised by the congregation's leadership for having differing or even dissenting views. The people my age, too, came from many diverse backgrounds and from different countries and languages, both Jews and Arabs from Israel, and others from the USA, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, etc. I was constantly reminded that my culture from the west coast of North America was merely my culture. This helped open my mind to the ideas of others. Thanks for the water, Sasha. Then there were the Shabbat morning Bible studies. Here, a variety of individuals, often scholars, offered the results of her or his detailed study of a specific passage from the Hebrew Bible, or just as often the Gospels. Seasoned teachers and people who had lived in Israel for decades, such as David Bivin, Helva Ronning, Yoni Garish, and Claire Fahn, to name a few, shared their insights about the geography, archaeology, history, animals, food, material culture, and social customs of the people from biblical times. One learned, too, about how ancient rabbis or the community at Qumran interpreted the scriptures, and how the teaching of Jesus and his followers was similar or differed. I got to learn about what graduate students at the Hebrew University were currently working on in their research. The original languages were constantly referred to. One could not escape the reality that the English version of the Bible one was familiar with is not the scriptures themselves, but merely an approximation of them. The person teaching was not the only one contributing meaningfully. Often other scholars in the room and students would add valuable information. It was a collective enterprise. At times there were disagreements, even with the person teaching. And if there were, afterwards people carried on life as usual. They were still friends. The whole experience was refreshing. When I first started attending, I could not always follow what was going on, though I tried. If I had been used to a weekly faucet drip of new understanding about the personalities of the Bible and their times at former congregations I'd been a part of, I was now subject to a veritable firefighter's hose of information. I couldn't possibly drink it all. And everyone seemed to share a large amount of assumed background understanding. I was constantly trying to play catch-up. Spontaneous gatherings throughout the week with people from the congregation and social gatherings on other occasions also played a role in my learning to love God with all of my mind. To be honest, it took some time before I finally felt like I was really welcome at such events. It took even longer before I felt like I belonged. Nevertheless, in these social contexts, I found out that the same people I learned so much from at Bible studies and so forth also knew how to play the beach, beat you at a game of settlers, enjoy good food and good conversation about daily life, and talk politics. And there again, people could disagree and be friends and move on. Most importantly, they all had a vibrant life of faith in God, demonstrating compassion to others and a trust that God would take care of them in times of need. To describe the complex DNA relationship, or makeup rather, in a few words of the Narkis Street congregation is difficult. I offer the following: contagious curiosity, humility, courageous teachability, community-based learning, long-term relationships, continuity between generations, involving personal mentoring, peer-to-peer collaboration, ethnic, national, and denominational diversity, collegiality with non-Christian Jews, respect for all the peoples of this land, Arabs, Armenians, Jews, expats, everyone, and a corollary recognition that questions often resist simple answers, whether it's questions about identity, what to do with the land, whatever. That is not the way God wants us to use our minds, to be very black and white and simplistic. Sometimes there are simple answers, but not often. Interest in biblical languages and related modern Hebrew. Attention to geography and archaeology here in Israel. Familiarity with ancient Jewish texts, whether rabbinic literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or other. And most importantly, a love for God and a love and an admiration for Jesus. Like others of my generation, I had never had the privilege of meeting Robert and Margaret Lindsey. Yet it is clear from what others say that those two contributed monumentally to the formation of a congregation which fosters a love for God with all of one's mind. And I don't mean just Bob, I mean Margaret as well. It was a team effort. The lectures we have heard in this conference already attest to this fact, especially for Bob. I will highlight briefly some other people and factors given in greater detail in Gary Alley's account of the Baptist House on Friday. From the beginning in this congregation, there has been attention given to modern Hebrew and study of the Bible. Those two things. Wash and Maddie Watts, Elsie Clore, Eunice Fenderson, and Henry Edelman all learned Hebrew and conducted group Bible studies here on this property. Particularly noteworthy are the Shabbat morning school for adults and afternoon youth Bible class, both conducted in Hebrew, led by Elsie and Eunice for years. Since the beginning, there has been continuity between generations. Elsie was at the Baptist House when Bob first visited Palestine in 1939 to 1940, and Eunice worked alongside Bob and Margaret for 16 years. Wash Watts and Henry Edelman both encouraged Bob to come to the land to study Hebrew. Continuity is also true of the generation following after Bob and Margaret. Though there are many people I could mention, I note here that Chuck and Liz Kopp knew, cherished, and or worked alongside Bob and Margaret in Israel for some 16 years once they joined the church. Ethnic diversity and thus diversity of opinion, too, has always been a pillar of the community. Remember that at the beginning, the Watts, an American couple, worked alongside an Arab and a Jew, Louis Hanna, and Chaim Volkovich, both followers of Jesus. From the 20s, this has already been that way. Important developments in the history of the Protestant Church, as well as larger developments in world history, also contributed to the formation of the congregation's DNA. Later today, Dr. Dan Hummel will discuss some of these factors at greater length. I highlight some salient points here. The Holocaust fostered an openness in many Protestants to stop seeing the Jews as a cursed people for having allegedly corporately crucified Jesus. Thanks to God for that. Some Christians became more open, too, to entertaining very hard questions about God as a result of the Holocaust. A humility and desire to learn grew. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls aroused greater curiosity in some of how Jesus could be understood in his Jewish context. Neo-evangelicalism resisted the notion of leaving the world to perish while waiting for Jesus to return. From Billy Graham to Preacher Halleck, Bob Lindsey's pastor and mentor, many Christians refused to be disengaged with contemporary culture. Archaeology, too, contributed to the openness to use one's mind in loving God. William Albright, for example, who argued for the historicity of such events as the Exodus, insisted on the need to read the New Testament through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, seeing a single continuous story. Consciously or subconsciously or both, these factors influenced Bob Lindsey and the other key members of the congregation in the middle of the 3rd century, helping to set the mood for actively loving God with all one's mind. Finally, I return now to that false dichotomy between heart and mind that was so damaging to me earlier on in my life. It has a relative. Surprise. A beloved cousin. The alleged notion that faith and reason are diametrically opposed. Out of ignorance, many Christians accept the false notion that, quote, to believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, end quote, Romans 10:9, is an act void of rational thought. This sort of misunderstanding takes various forms. It is perhaps strongest when it comes to some Christians' notions of what it means to learn by reading the Scriptures. You may have heard someone say, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. The implication is that to know what God said, all one has to do is read. Though through the simple act of reading alone, accompanied by faith, one culls truth from the Scriptures. No use of the mind is involved, it is implied. A popular Christian song expresses a similar sentiment. I stand alone on the word of God, the Bible. Similar to, in many people's mind, is the Reformers' cry, sola scriptura. In an unqualified sense, these claims cannot be true. I offer 5 reasons, and I'm going to go through these 5 very quickly. First, there is the very important issue of translation. All who read the Bible in translation and are honest with themselves must admit that they are relying on the authority of experts. I don't have time to go into detail, although believe me, I've written enough about this. But you need to know that there are 2 different types of experts. One are experts in the biblical languages, and the other are translators. Experts in the biblical languages have a challenge, a hurdle, because no one speaks them. There are no native speakers. Therefore, it takes a lot of detective work to find out what those ancient languages are really doing and what the terms, phrases, everything, what they really mean. Translators have a tough time because no one language actually maps onto another. It's impossible. Therefore, there are always choices that are made, and there's always meaning that is left aside. And whenever someone reads in translation, we rely on those other people. It is not just me in the Bible directly to God. That's impossible. You must be honest with that, and that is exercising your mind and loving God, recognizing that you're resting your knowledge on others. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's be honest. My second point is that we also must trust the scribes who over the centuries have copied and preserved this for us. We're trusting that we don't have the original autographs of anything, and we're trusting that they made the right decisions and that they did a pretty good job. I'll give you one quick anecdote. The Aleppo Codex was, and a codex is a book, as opposed to a papyrus, which is a scroll. The Aleppo Codex was the best text we had for the Hebrew Bible. It was damaged in 1947. We have, for example, we have very little of the first 5 books of Moses now, the 5 books of Moses. And that means that the Leningrad Codex has the best text, is the most complete, although the Aleppo Codex actually has the best text. There are more mistakes in Leningrad than in Aleppo, but Aleppo isn't complete. Why did God let that happen? Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I can say this much. We can't rely on either one of them, and plus there are also readings in Dead Sea Scrolls that are, in certain cases, superior to both, which means that it takes intelligent people who are worshiping God with their mind, textual critics, to figure out what are the best readings. Jason Driesbach from our congregation is an example of a text critic who does that. Again, we're not only trusting on linguistic scholars and translators, but also text critics. They are a part of our understanding of God through the Bible. It's not just me in the Bible. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That just cannot, that's not honest. That's not honest at all. It's a community thing that God has given to the church. Thank you. I agree. That it's a very important, and it's a tiring endeavor. Fourth and finally, and I wish I could go into this in more detail, it's the issue of the canon. Who picked the books of the Bible? It's not just me and God. If that were the case, every believer would go home on their own and pray about which books should be in the canon. But we don't do that. We trust the church decisions that were made earlier. And don't forget, as Protestants, we trust the Reformers. We're relying on them. But they even disagreed amongst themselves. There were 4 books that Luther didn't want in the Bible, and he put them in an appendix at the back of his translation. Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. He didn't want them in. Modern Lutheran Bibles put them back in where everyone else has them, but that's not what Luther thought. So we must be honest with the fact that even the Reformers didn't agree. There was disagreement, and God is okay with that. But we are trusting in God and not in humans. We do our part, textual criticism, translation, putting the canon together, whatever we can do. But essentially, what I like about this is rather than standing on the Bible alone, I like the song, "My faith is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness," or "On this the solid rock I stand." No other, all of the ground is sinking sand. Jesus is that solid ground. That is Jesus the person, not some. You can burn this. You can burn this. You can't kill Jesus. He'll just come back to life. That is where my faith is. Give me 2 minutes and I'll wrap up here. I'm at the very end. I'm going to have less than a page. I'll go from here. The many followers of Jesus, some alive and many no longer alive, as well as those for whom Jesus is not their Lord, who have contributed to each of our understanding of what the scriptures are and what they say used or use their minds to carry out their work. Modern day believers use their minds too when they read the Bible, even in the deceptively simple act of accepting the biblical canon handed down to them and choosing a translation to read. The notion of faith devoid of reason does not exist, certainly not for reading the Bible. No believer is an island to him or herself, and that includes scholars, and most scholars will actually recognize that because they realize their own limitations. Of course, many kinds of specialists mentioned in the foregoing have been or are members of the Narkee Street congregation, from biblical linguists, translators, and textual critics to archaeologists, specialists in geography, source critics, and scholars of biblical literature. This is, as I mentioned above, one of the reasons that the congregation is a fertile seedbed for learning to love God with all of our minds. Exercising one's mind in their love of God extends far beyond the realm of biblical scholarship. For example, again, my wife, Dr. Joanna Wu, is an astrophysicist who loves God as she researches star formation in galaxies. I want to pause here at the conclusion of my presentation in order to reflect on the crucial role that Pastor Chuck Kopp has played during the past 23 years in fostering this special aspect of the congregation. Chuck is a free thinker, open and interested in others' perspectives. He stays well informed on a wide variety of issues, from local and international politics to biblical studies. He speaks modern Hebrew and Spanish fluently. He has studied Greek and follows the arguments of biblical scholars made from original languages. You have to understand that in any other congregation in the world, Chuck would be a superstar as a pastor in terms of biblical studies. In this congregation, his light isn't seen as brightly because there's so many scholars here, but he enables them to be here because he's not threatened by them, because he knows what's going on. He neither squelches the opinions of scholars in the congregation nor gulps them down wholesale. He seeks for all to use their own gifts to the best of their potential without letting petty things such as jealousy, vainglory, or fear get in the way. His support of biblical studies in particular and worshiping God through the exercise of one's cognitive faculties in general has been absolutely vital, and I cannot underscore that more, absolutely vital in the continuity of the congregation's DNA and indeed in its development. Now, by loving God with our minds, as we exercise faith, we become more humble, not only appreciating the contributions of others to our lives, but also in recognizing the limits of our own knowledge and understanding. We trust God to make up the difference where we lack. I offer God my deepest gratitude for working through the lives of so many saints here, you, on this property in Jerusalem, and those that have already passed away throughout the last century and this one, to form a community of the faithful in which I have been able to grow with others in loving God with all of my heart, all of my life force, and all of my strength. Thank you.
Great. So we have a few minutes for some questions. Jordash, oh, there's Steve over there. Okay. And then we're going to take a break because apparently there's some nationwide drill. A siren's going to go off, and then for those who want to, at 11:05, for those who want to participate, you can go down to the bomb shelter. For those of you who want to participate in it, you can go down to the bomb shelter. You don't have to if you don't want to. So we're going to take a break and then come back. But we'll take some questions now. Dov, I see you there first. Do we have that mic? Where is that?
Right
here. Okay.
It's partly question, partly comment. First of all, the few times that we've met before, I've had occasion to admire your command of Hebrew.
Thanks.
And you've proven it today very successfully. I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, give me an English rendering of Genesis 4:7.
Genesis 4:7. Okay. הלא אם תיטיב שאת ואם לא תיטיב לפתח חטאת רובץ ואליך תשוקתו ואתה תמשול בו. Is it not the case that if you do well to lift, and if you do not do well, that sin is crouching and ready to pounce at the gate? Its desire is going to be towards you, or its desire is towards you, but you will rule over it. But you will rule over it.
But that's not what you will rule over it. That's one rendering.
Okay, how would you?
Most renderings are, but you must rule over it. But that's not what the Hebrew says. It doesn't say ve'alecha limshol bo. It says ve'ata timshol bo. This is obviously a question. Ve'ata timshol bo.
Okay. Thank you. Good point. I didn't know. Yeah.
We'll make it quick because we're going to.
And as much as there's a scarcity of women on these boards, I thought I would say something. The scriptures about, we as Christians, we take, and I appreciate examining each part of us, our heart, our mind, our soul. But I got a little sick when I got just in the spirit. It was teaching just the spirit, and never mind your body was decaying, So I was so happy to hear about what I found out about the Jewish concept is that that we're considered part, not just this part and that part, but we're a whole. And so I found as a Christian, they would put your right hand in and your left hand in and maybe your head. But I felt better as a Jewish person that they dealt with the whole. And I want, if anything, I want shalom. I want to be whole. I want to be balanced. I want to be well.
I think that was actually a very helpful comment. I want to say that the similarity between the biblical and the Greek view that you mentioned, I think there's even closer relationship in the Stoic physics and physiology, because the Stoics thought that the governing part of the soul, the hegemonikon, resides in the heart. And they also thought that emotions are connected with the heart. Most emotions they regarded as disturbances of the hegemonikon, which prevent it from operating properly. Though there are some feelings like joy and calm and so on, which they thought reflected the hegemonikon, which was in order. So I think they have a very close connection to the, I mean, in the Stoic. And people have noticed, others have noticed that similarities between Stoic philosophy and rabbinic thought. But when one take this into account, then I think, apart from all the things you mentioned at the end as obstacles to biblical literalism, I think even once you've learned the original language and languages, and you've learned what the concepts are, and you understand, and so on and so forth, you're left with the fact that they use the physics and the physiology, which we just don't have anymore today. So, I mean, when it talks about the mind and this and that, you know, all these different things and so on, you can translate them. But then the question is, what is the message that it gives to us today? And I think the message is a very simple one. It means that you have to love God with everything that makes up your reality, your personal reality, whether it's physical or your reality or your faculties and so on. You have to use everything that is part of you in the service of God. And therefore, even to distinguish today between heart and mind, again, modern physiology makes it very difficult to see what this distinction means. But if you say that the message is you have to love with your whole person. However, today we understand what the whole person is, and I think, but that's not a translation. That's not a translation of the text. It's trying to understand the message of the text in today's terms, and that is why Christian dogma and Christian scripture have always been two separate things, because Christian dogma has always had to take into account scientific knowledge and all kinds of things which present, because people are living in a different reality or a different understanding of basic understanding of reality centuries later than the biblical times.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'd just add to that, and I owe this point to a colleague of mine at the University of Zurich. His name is Philip Lassiter. He has shown in his research how following David Hume and these other Scottish philosophers, what's entered the English language is this term emotion, which really didn't exist prior to the influence of French in, say, the 18th century through these philosophers, that earlier we talked about feelings and affections of the soul. And you can see this in books like Sense and Sensibility or whatever, that an affection is a movement of the soul, and it's an active thing. There's many other factors that I could discuss about it, but for this, just responding to your point, David Hume and those that are in his line of thinking wanted to have some kind of discussion about human anthropology that was quasi-Newtonian. They wanted to have it so that there was no soul, there was just atoms or material, and they wanted to explain feelings coming out of that. And so actually feelings for them are completely separate from rational thought. That is not the case prior to this period in history. This is not the case for centuries, and this is certainly not the case in the biblical period, whereas your emotions, or your feelings rather, and your thoughts are very intimately interconnected.
Okay, I think we'll... the drill's coming. All right, I think we'll take a break now so we can have a break, and then we'll come back for the rest of the panel.